Ever wonder what your night shift would look like if you worked in Victorian London and your job description involved shovels, darkness, and fresh graves? Not exactly the career guidance counselor had in mind, but in early 19th century England, being a resurrection man paid shockingly well. Medical schools needed bodies, the law wouldn't supply enough of them legally, and someone had to fill that gap in the market. That someone was you, operating in the graveyard shadows of a city that was desperate for doctors but terrified of where their training material came from. The money was too good to pass up, even if it meant risking a pitchfork mob or a prison sentence, a shortage that could not be filled. Here's the basic economic equation of your new profession. London's medical schools were churning out doctors at an unprecedented rate, but they only had access to about 3 to 5 bodies per year for dissection, all legally obtained. The Murder Act of 1752 had specified that executed murderers could be dissected instead of buried, which was supposed to act as both punishment and a supply line for anatomy teaching. The problem was that the number of executions simply wasn't keeping up with demand. By the 1820s, London had multiple major teaching hospitals, Guy's and St. Thomas's and Bart's and others, all competing for the same extremely limited legal supply of cadavers. Each anatomy lecturer needed roughly 1 body per student for their course, and class sizes were swelling. The math simply didn't work, which is where you came in. The resurrection trade wasn't born from moral depravity so much as basic supply and demand. Medical students couldn't learn surgery on diagrams, and professors weren't about to tell their classes that they'd need to imagine what the inside of a human abdomen looked like. The demand was constant, the legal supply was laughably inadequate, and the price per body reflected that desperation. Your night job starts at midnight. You work the hours that decent people are asleep, which works out nicely for your business model. Graveyards in London weren't exactly the serene, romanticized places of later Victorian morning. They were overcrowded, chaotic, and frequently had bodies buried shallow and fast, sometimes multiple coffins stacked in a single grave with mere inches of dirt separating them. That's your target. You and your partner have a system down by now. One person keeps watch for the night watchman, whose presence becomes a running calculation in your head. Some graveyards hired guards, others relied on angry relatives, and a few had installed primitive iron cages over graves. You carry your tools with practiced efficiency: a wooden shovel that makes less noise than iron, a canvas sack or tarp, and sometimes a crowbar for coffins that won't cooperate. The process itself is physically demanding but straightforward. You locate the fresh grave by looking for disturbed earth, sometimes marker stones that families couldn't afford to replace with proper memorials. Dig down, remove the soil quietly, pry open the coffin, extract the body, and refill the grave as best you can. Families visiting the next day wouldn't immediately notice anything was wrong. The entire operation might take 40 minutes if everything went smoothly, hours if the ground was frozen or you had to work around obstacles. Winter was actually your prime season, not just because bodies stayed preserved in the cold longer, but because the frozen ground made your work harder, but also made graves less likely to be visited frequently by grieving families in bad weather. Your customer base wasn't anonymous either. You knew which anatomy lecturers were paying the best rates this month, who was behind on their accounts, and which schools were expanding their programs and needed extra bodies. The relationships were almost professional, in a macabre sort of way. The price of a body in London. What you get paid depends on market conditions, competition, and the condition of the merchandise. A fresh, undamaged adult body might fetch you 8 to 10 guineas in the 1820s, which was roughly equivalent to several months of wages for an unskilled laborer. Children's bodies commanded less money, but were easier to transport and handle. If you could deliver a body that hadn't begun to decompose, with no obvious injuries that might indicate foul play beyond the grave robbing itself, you were looking at the upper end of that price range. But there were complications. Medical schools were increasingly particular about what they would accept. Bodies with obvious signs of disease might be rejected, and professors sometimes complained that resurrection men were delivering bodies in poor condition or swapping corpses to meet quotas. Your reputation mattered in this business, not for morality but for reliability. Some resurrection men operated exclusively for one anatomist, developing a regular route and understanding exactly what their customer needed. Others worked freelance, selling to whoever was paying best that week. The competition could get heated. There were stories of rival gangs watching each other's work and swooping in to steal bodies that had already been dug up, or sabotaging graves to make them harder to access. Graveyards became contested territory, and your knowledge of which burial sites were poorly guarded or which cemeteries had lax night watchmen was valuable professional intelligence. You might even pay off a night watchman occasionally if the bribe cost less than what you'd make from a single body. It was all business calculations, risk assessment, and knowing who could be bought. Public panic and graveyard riots. The general public was not exactly thrilled about your line of work, and for good reason. The idea that their loved ones might not be resting in peace was genuinely horrifying to Victorians, who had elaborate mourning rituals and deep religious beliefs about bodily resurrection. Newspapers carried sensational stories about body snatching, and public outrage occasionally boiled over into riots. Families took extraordinary measures to protect graves. Iron cages called mortsafes were installed over graves to prevent access, though these were expensive and mostly used by the wealthy. Poorer communities resorted to more desperate methods, placing heavy stones on graves, planting thorny bushes, or taking turns watching over burial grounds. In some cases, entire communities mobilized to guard graveyards during periods when resurrectionist activity was suspected. The fear wasn't irrational, either. There were enough documented cases of bodies going missing that the panic was based on real threats. Medical students themselves became targets of public anger. Riots occurred in London when crowds attacked anatomy schools, convinced that the professors and their students were complicit in the grave-robbing trade. The relationship between medical progress and public distrust was deeply uneasy. Doctors desperately needed bodies to advance medical knowledge and train surgeons, but the public saw only desecration and profit. Your role in this economic and ethical deadlock put you in physical danger regularly. Getting caught didn't just mean legal trouble. It meant the very real possibility of being beaten or killed by an angry mob. Police were sometimes ambivalent about pursuing resurrection cases too vigorously, since they knew medical schools needed bodies, but public pressure forced periodic crackdowns. The Burke and Hare game changer. Everything changed in 1828 when news broke from Edinburgh about William Burke and William Hare, who decided that digging up graves was inefficient when they could simply create their own supply. Over roughly 10 months, they murdered 16 people and sold the bodies to the anatomist Robert Knox, who apparently didn't ask too many questions about where his supply was coming from. The difference between your profession and theirs was that you were stealing bodies; they were manufacturing them. The public reaction was horror on a scale that grave robbing alone had never provoked. Burke and Hare weren't just breaking taboos about burial, they were actively killing people for profit, which crossed a line even in a society that had grown somewhat numb to body snatching. The case became a media sensation, and it had immediate consequences for you. The Anatomy Act of 1832 was passed in direct response to the scandal, fundamentally changing the legal framework for obtaining bodies for dissection. Under the new act, unclaimed bodies from workhouses, hospitals, and prisons could legally be used for anatomy, provided relatives didn't come forward to claim them. This dramatically increased the legal supply and essentially eliminated the economic incentive for resurrection men. The act also imposed much harsher penalties for illegal body procurement, making the risks of your job significantly higher while simultaneously reducing the potential profits. The Burke and Hare case also changed public perception. What had been seen as a somewhat grubby but understandable necessity became associated with murder and greed. Sympathy for resurrection men evaporated almost overnight. After your era, the Anatomy Act changes everything. The Anatomy Act of 1832 didn't immediately end body snatching, but it made your profession far less viable. The new law created a regulated system for obtaining bodies, which meant anatomists could get what they needed legally and without relying on shadowy nighttime operations. Workhouses became the primary source of cadavers, which introduced its own ethical problems, but at least kept bodies out of graveyards. The price per body dropped as supply increased, making your dangerous night work less economically attractive. Police enforcement of the new laws became more consistent as well. Where before there had been a degree of unofficial tolerance, now there was political pressure to crack down on resurrectionists. Some body snatching continued, particularly in rural areas where the new system took longer to implement, but the golden age of resurrection men in London was effectively over. Medical schools transitioned to their new supply chains, and the public focus shifted to worrying about whether poor people in workhouses would receive proper burials. Your career had been a brief window of criminal enterprise made possible by legal inadequacy and medical necessity. The Victorian obsession with death and mourning that would develop later in the century was in part a reaction to this era, when even graves couldn't be considered secure. The elaborate Victorian cemetery movements and the ritualization of burial practices were direct responses to a time when the dead could not rest in peace. What actually happened to you? Some resurrection men managed to transition into related work. A few became legitimate undertakers or cemetery employees, using their knowledge of burial practices for legal purposes. Others simply disappeared from the historical record, their trade having become obsolete almost overnight. A small number were arrested and prosecuted under the new laws, but most likely moved on to other criminal enterprises or legitimate work as the economics of body snatching collapsed. The profession that had provided you with a dangerous but lucrative income for years vanished as quickly as it had emerged. Medical education continued to advance, now with a steady legal supply of bodies, but the uneasy relationship between medical progress and public distrust of doctors lingered. The Burke and Hare murders had revealed how far some people would go for profit, and the Anatomy Act was designed to prevent that from happening again by creating a controlled system. Your part in this strange chapter of medical history was essentially finished. You had operated in the shadowy space between what doctors needed and what society would permit, and society had finally decided to close that space. The graves of London were a little more secure, though the workhouses now had their own problems to worry about. For better or worse, the era of the Resurrection Man had passed, leaving behind a strange legacy of medical progress achieved through morally questionable means. The business model was always doomed. What's wild about your entire career is how unstable the economics were from the start. You were filling a temporary gap created by outdated laws and rapidly expanding medical education, but it was always going to be resolved one way or another. The Murder Act of 1752 had tried to balance punishment for murder with the medical need for bodies, but it couldn't account for how quickly medical schools would multiply or how many doctors the country needed. The resurrection trade was basically an unofficial amendment to that law, an unregulated gray market that operated until Parliament finally caught up with reality. Your job was made possible by legal lag and eliminated when that lag was addressed. The prices you could command, the risks you took, the constant tension between public outrage and medical necessity, all of it existed because the law hadn't kept pace with social and technological change. When the Anatomy Act finally passed, it didn't just regulate body procurement. It acknowledged that the old system had failed everyone. Doctors had been forced into morally compromising positions, families had lived in fear of grave desecration, and criminals like Burke and Hare had found ways to exploit the chaos. Your role in this was purely economic, supplying a demand that the law wouldn't officially acknowledge but that society couldn't do without. The Victorian London that emerged after 1832 was different, more regulated, more orderly, but also perhaps more honest about the uncomfortable bargains that medical progress sometimes requires. The doctors pretend not to know. The strangest part of your working life is that everyone involved understands the arrangement, but almost nobody wants to say the whole sentence out loud. Anatomy lecturers need bodies. You bring bodies. The bodies are suspiciously fresh, suspiciously silent, and usually arrive at suspicious hours. Somehow, the paperwork remains emotionally unavailable. London's medical teachers could not train competent surgeons with polite theory alone. A student who had never opened a human body was a danger with a scalpel, and 19th-century surgery was already terrifying enough without adding guesswork. Hospitals needed men who knew where arteries ran, how organs sat inside the torso, and what a diseased lung actually looked like when the owner was no longer using it. That knowledge came from dissection. Dissection came from bodies. Bodies came from you. So the transaction develops its own etiquette. You do not march through the front door carrying a corpse over your shoulder while whistling. You deliver at night, through side entrances, to assistants or porters who know exactly when to be available. Money changes hands. Questions are kept politely vague. If anyone asks, the body is simply a subject, as if renaming the dead person makes the whole thing less awkward. The language does a lot of work here. A corpse becomes a subject. Grave robbing becomes procurement. Desecration becomes education. Congratulations, you have discovered bureaucracy. Some anatomists were more cautious than others. A few paid regular suppliers because reliability mattered. Others bought from whoever appeared with usable material. The more famous the school, the more pressure it faced from students, rivals, and the public. A lecturer without enough bodies could lose students to another school, and students paid fees. Medical education was not just a noble quest for knowledge. It was also a competitive business where the supply chain wore a dirty coat and knew which churchyard had the laziest watchman. That does not mean every doctor was a cartoon villain. Many sincerely believed they were advancing medicine and reducing suffering. They were probably right about that part. The problem is that being right about the destination does not magically disinfect the road. Surgeons learned from the dead, but poor families paid the emotional price when those dead vanished from graves. You are the person who makes that contradiction impossible to ignore, which is exactly why society would rather treat you as the whole problem and not the symptom. The grave protection industry gets creative. Once families realize the dead are being stolen, burial becomes less about mourning and more about security design. Wealthier households pay for iron cages, heavy slabs, locked vaults, and hired guards. Some cemeteries build watch houses where men can sit through the night with lanterns, clubs, and the delightful knowledge that their job is basically corpse bouncer. In Scotland, mortsafes become especially famous, but London has its own versions of defensive burial: railings, stones, guarded churchyards, and communal vigilance. Poor families have fewer options, so they get inventive. They pile stones on fresh graves. They arrange branches and thorns. They take turns watching through the first nights after burial, because a fresh body is the valuable one. After decomposition begins, your customers lose interest. That means the first week is everything. Grief gets put on a schedule. Mourners cannot simply cry and go home. They have to wonder whether Uncle Thomas needs a night shift. This creates a grim little arms race. Families protect graves. You learn how to bypass protections. churches hire watchmen. You learn which watchman drinks, which one naps, and which one will accept a payment that he will later describe to his conscience as an unfortunate misunderstanding. Ironwork gets heavier. Your tools get better. Everyone involved becomes a reluctant expert in anti-theft grave management, which is not a phrase any healthy civilization should need. The fear also changes how people talk about death. A proper burial is supposed to give dignity, order, and religious comfort. Body snatching makes burial feel temporary. The coffin is no longer a final resting place. It is a container with a resale problem. That is why public anger burns so hot. You are not stealing jewelry, though grave robbers did that too. You are stealing the person. Even if the soul is believed to have moved on, the body still carries family memory, religious meaning, and social honor. Dragging it to a dissecting room feels, to many people, like a second death. And because the poor are most vulnerable, the outrage has a class edge. Rich families can buy protection. Poor families have bodies worth just as much to anatomists, but far less money to defend them. The law that failed to supply medical schools also failed to protect working people from becoming unofficial anatomy stock. Victorian London will eventually build grand cemeteries and cleaner systems. But in your era, dignity depends partly on whether your relatives can afford iron. The worst night is the one that goes loud. Most successful jobs are boring in the way crimes want to be boring. You dig, lift, cover, leave. The worst nights are the ones that become stories. A watchman hears a shovel scrape against stone. A dog starts barking. A grieving brother, sleeping in a nearby shed because he does not trust people like you, comes out swinging. Suddenly your quiet business model has become cardio. If you are caught in a graveyard, you have a few miserable options. Run and abandon the body, which means losing the night's profit. Fight, which risks murder charges or a skull injury. Talk, which rarely works when you are standing next to an open grave holding a sack. Some resurrection men carried weapons, but weapons made everything worse if the police got involved. The smartest tool is still speed. Alleys, fences, side gates, and which streets are quiet after midnight. London at night is a maze, and your survival depends on knowing it better than the men chasing you. There is also the psychological wear. You can joke about the work, and resurrection men surely did, because humans will make jokes in almost any sewer life digs for them. But the job requires you to treat grief as opportunity. Fresh burial means fresh inventory. A funeral procession is not just a sad event, it is market research. You watch families, estimate wealth, judge protection, and return later if the risk looks worth it. That does something to a person, even if he pretends otherwise. The city does not forget either. Rumors attach to you. Neighbors wonder why you sleep during the day, why your clothes smell of earth, why you suddenly have money after a funeral. In tight working-class districts, anonymity is harder than outsiders imagine. You may operate at night, but daylight still has eyes. If public anger points your way, you might find your home watched, your friends questioned, and your name spat in the street. The dead are silent. Their relatives are not. The anatomy school smells like trouble. By the time your delivery reaches the anatomy school, dawn may already be bruising the edge of London. Inside, the building has its own atmosphere: lamp smoke, damp coats, sharp chemicals, and the heavy silence of people pretending this is all very normal. Students gather around tables because this is their education, and the body you carried through mud is about to become a lesson in arteries, nerves, organs, and professional detachment. The room is not glamorous. Early 19th century dissection is messy, practical, and often rushed because preservation is a constant enemy. Ice helps in winter. Spirits and other chemicals help a little. Mostly, everyone works against time. A fresh subject is valuable because decay ruins detail, and detail is the entire point. Surgeons need to see where a blade can go, and where it absolutely should not. Nobody wants a doctor learning anatomy for the first time while a living patient is screaming on a table. That is technically education, but in the same way, falling off a roof is a lesson in gravity. So there is the uncomfortable bargain again. Your crime helps create knowledge. The knowledge helps save lives. The families you robbed would not find that comforting, and honestly, they should not have to.